2024, something shocking had happened in Bihar. Nearly 10 bridges collapsed in a span of just 15 days. Immediately, officials and ministers blamed it on the abnormal amount of rain during the monsoon. But what if rain is no longer just a weather event? What if it is a structural force that our infrastructure was never built to survive? India's bridges are failing, and it's not just only poor construction. Climate change is quietly altering that engineering equation. And today, we are here to tell you why are bridges failing in India. Welcome back to another episode of Mission Planet A, and today we are here to unpack why bridges cannot just survive Indian monsoon. This is your host Rupa, and we are at episode 17 of season 2. If you like our content, then subscribe to us on YouTube and do follow us on Instagram so you never miss out on an update. Now let's get right into the episode. Let's start with the scale of the problem. In the last 4 years, nearly 170 bridges collapsed, killing nearly 202 people. Bihar recorded the highest number with 26 bridge collapses. Uttarakhand follows suit with 25, and then Himachal Pradesh is at 17 bridge collapses. This isn't just bad luck. This is what happens when infrastructure built for the climate of 1985 meets the climate of 2026. In July 2024, in Siwan, Bihar, 2 bridges collapsed within a span of just 10 days. The under-construction Agwani Sultanganj Bridge collapsed 3 times, making it the 16th bridge collapse in Bihar since June 2024. In Jamai district, a bridge was literally swept away by strong rainwater currents following in 3 days of intense rainfall. In 2025, the National Highway 66 again collapsed near Malappuram, which was built over a filled paddy field. Now, wetlands, which once upon a time absorbed rainwater, are now increasingly converted into expressways or logistic corridors or highways. That is the scale of problem in India. And yet, we don't take it seriously. We don't even treat it as a systemic issue. We treat it as a one-off event or the consequence of a natural calamity. But what if I were to tell you that the main reason that bridges collapse in India is not just poor construction, but the refusal to accept that climate change is a real threat? Yes, climate change has everything to do with why bridges are failing in India. Every bridge is designed around 2 things: design age and design flood. Now, design age is essentially the worst kind of flood the engineers expect the bridge to face. It is just purely based on historical data, and that number sets a benchmark. But that's also where the problem is, because a flood that was expected once in 50 years is now occurring once every 5 years. So the math really doesn't math anymore. Climate change is severely altering the peak discharge, runoff velocity, and rainfall intensity. Foundations that were once designed for a certain scour depth are now being exposed to flows that exceed design assumptions. Now imagine the bridge to be a table with the legs buried in the riverbed. Now imagine the river moving faster than it ever has. So it slowly starts scooping out the sand around those legs. Nobody sees it's happening. The table looks fine until one day it doesn't, and it gives away. Intense and erratic rainfall almost every other year is a sign of changing climate. A 2026 vulnerability assessment of river bridges in Kolhapur found that flooding caused by heavy rains is one of the most frequent and severe structural threat to bridges. Now, India builds bridges in 2 different ways: concrete and steel. Now, what's fascinating about it is that climate breaks both of them, just differently. Take reinforced concrete for instance. Concrete looks solid to our eyes, but there are steel rods running through it like bones in our own body. When water gets in, these rods rust, and rust doesn't shrink, it expands. It pushes outward from inside the concrete, much like how a seed pushes through the soil. By the time you see the crack on the outside, the damage has already been happening inside for a lot number of years. So that is why concrete bridge collapses almost feel sudden and shocking. You don't see any visible stress. Just suddenly one day the slab gives away. Now you would think that steel bridges are much tougher and stronger. Of course, to an extent they are, but steel has its own enemy, corrosion, and climate is accelerating it. Now, in coastal cities like Chennai and Mumbai, the air itself acts against these bridges. The salt in the atmosphere gets into the welded joints, into the bolts, and finally into the framework. And metal fatigue slowly starts building up. And here's the thing about how India maintains its bridges. We check them once every 30, 40 years or when something worse happens. But that can be done when the climate is predictable, not when it is erratic and unpredictable like this. So we have two different materials and two different failure modes, but just one common thread. Both were designed for a climate that no longer exists. And this isn't just a problem with old bridges. In October last year, a newly constructed bridge in Dhanbad collapsed after heavy rainfall, cutting off nearly 10 villages. And not just that, in some cases, bridges showed cracks just after it was inaugurated. Now, this only means one thing: climate change is interacting with both aging infrastructure and newly built projects. So, is poor construction a part of the problem? To an extent, yes. Rushed construction for electoral timelines, poor tender transparency, and lack of maintenance are some of the few things that we often see happening in India. But I want to be precise here. Deeper failure is not just about few shortcuts in construction, but the fact that there is an absence of climate resilience in design thinking. Climate proofing a bridge means flood return period modeling that accounts for future rainfall and not just historical data. It means corrosion-resistant alloys, especially in coastal and high humidity zones. It means mapping how river courses shift over decades. India's infrastructure budget is enormous. Under the union budget announced last month, the centre has reaffirmed its commitment to infrastructure development by raising public capital expenditure to nearly 12.2 trillion. That's literally 3.1% of our entire GDP. So it doesn't mean we don't have the money, we're just not putting it where our mouth is. And another major drawback is how these bridge collapses are looked at in India. Now, even when our leaders were speaking about the air pollution in the parliament, it was treated as though it is just a one-off environmental event and not as a major health crisis. Now, that's where the entire problem lies. We've already done a video on the air crisis in India, so do check it out. The link is in the description. The union government does not necessarily contain a green spending or like a green budget. It tells a familiar story. India is trying to build a 21st century economy with archaic relationships with land, water, forests, and coasts. A climate resilient bridge could have solved the lives of those 202 people. Now, this is not an unsolvable problem. Other countries have done it and shown it to us. Rotterdam, a city in the Netherlands, cracked this puzzle of building durable bridges. Instead of fighting water through rigid concrete engineering, Rotterdam invested billions into adaptive and flood-compatible transport systems. They built bridge foundations that allowed controlled inundation, which are built on floating or elevated platforms, and use permeable embankments so that water can seep through. They were truly smart people, and most importantly, they acknowledged that climate change was a real threat, and they integrated water safety into urban infrastructure. Likewise, bridges were redesigned in New York, but when they did it, they thought of a 100-year floodplain expansion, raising sea levels, groundwater-induced corrosion, and salt water seeping into the steel reinforcements. They thought of it all. China also invested in the sponge city model. Instead of just relying on storm drains alone, bridges and flyovers were built with permeable paving so that water can seep through. Vegetative embankments were used and flood-tolerant load-bearing decks were also taken care of. So like the name, the sponge city model captures, retains, and slowly releases the excess rainfall through thoughtful infrastructure. So now that meant that there were no sudden floods or breaking bridges. Now, going back to our budget spills, we already saw that the union budget allocated a significant amount of money for capital expenditure. But let me be clear again, that does not necessarily mean improved and safe bridge designs, or it definitely does not guarantee any climate resilient design thinking. Right now, the budget only emphasizes on the scale of the project and the delivery of the infrastructure, meaning how fast the project was completed. Independent research highlights a serious decline in targeted adaptation funds in India. Broad programs like the National Adaptation Fund for Climate Change have seen allocations fall drastically in recent years. But apart from funds, if we look at India, the project appraisal norms simply don't require a climate risk stress testing or future thinking. Now back to our question, can India accommodate such frameworks? Technically yes, but politically and financially, that's the fracture point. In India, the bridges fall under the Ministry of Road Transport and Highways or the state PWDs. Now, climate change falls under the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. And urban flooding falls under municipal corporations. Now, that's also another big problem. There is no integrated resilience budgeting mechanism linking all the three together. So, when a new bridge is commissioned, it's almost never designed by taking into consideration the changing rainfall intensity, heat-induced expansion or groundwater salinity or even river course shifts. The project appraisals simply don't require these norms. So the result is that every time a bridge falls and we rebuild it, we're just rebuilding it for future failures. The money exists, the knowledge exists, and what doesn't exist yet is political will to treat climate change as a design thinking rather than just as an excuse. In July 2024, 10 bridges collapsed in Bihar in just 15 days. Officials called it as an act of nature. The 202 people who died because of bridge collapse in the last 4 years did not die because of intense rainfall. They died because the infrastructure they trusted was in a world that climate change has taken away from us. And nobody in power has seriously reckoned with that yet. Now that reckoning needs to happen in budget allocations, in the design codes, in the way we appraise infrastructure projects, and most importantly, in the way we look at these bridge collapses, not as natural calamities, but as policy failures. Now that was Mission Planet A to you. Today we uncovered why bridges fail in India. If this episode made you think, then share it with someone who needs to hear. Subscribe and follow us on Instagram, and I'll see you in the next one. This is your host Rupa, signing off.